Hi, I'm Mark Tyrrell of Uncommon Knowledge, and welcome to how to positively reframe your client's negative traits. 3 tips to turn negative self-appraisals into strengths. Now, as the Gautama Buddha said, every thought we have either contributes to truth or illusion. Now, I don't know about you, but I try never to be glib with my clients. A glib reframe is essentially a contradiction. And people don't like to be contradicted, even if you're negating their reality with all the best intentions in the world. So here's an example of a glib reframe. The client says, "I'm such a terrible person," and the therapist replies, "No, you're not, you're wonderful." Now that is a reframe, and I personally might enjoy hearing someone describe me as wonderful, but after the ego buzz wore off, I'd probably conclude the person doesn't know me any better than someone who calls me absolutely terrible. Good and evil, or at least good and bad, are inside all of us, at least potentially. But someone with low self-esteem will not tend to feel better after compliments and praise, and may even feel worse. A danger of the glib reframe is that it may cause the rebound effect. In other words, it may cause a client to cling ever tighter to their limiting belief because they instinctively feel it's under threat, and you're therefore out of rapport with them. You don't understand their reality and perceptions at all. Clients can often, and do sometimes, protect the familiar, even if it's self-defeating. So the response to "No, you're not terrible, you're wonderful," maybe "You just don't understand me." The more we push, the more they pull. People need to feel understood in their limitations before we can help them overcome those limitations and perceive wider horizons. So don't get me wrong, glib and direct reframes will work with some people, especially if their self-esteem is already healthy and they have, and they've never genuinely looked at something in the way that you describe it to them. But for those with low self-esteem, being too positive about them to them can make them feel worse, not better. So when reframing limiting and self-harming beliefs, we need to consider acceptability. Is the client able to assimilate the reframe? Do we need to use metaphor or analogy or even paradox in order to help instill the new, more positive perceptual possibility into the client's mind without them automatically and defensively rejecting it? Timing is also important. Is the client ready for a new way of seeing? If they're not ready for a confrontational reframe, we may simply end up in a sort of tussle with them as they desperately defend their limiting belief, feeling that we don't understand them or their situation. Our well-intentioned argument with them is still an argument, after all. When our clients feel fundamentally misunderstood by us, we and they lose something very valuable. Only through a sense of shared understanding can a client come to trust us. Without this rapport, our attempts to help them see themselves in a different light are likely to fall flat. And this is a big deal because how people feel they fundamentally are has, of course, huge implications for how they live. Labeling has an immense power to determine lives, and people label other people and themselves in all kinds of ways, and sometimes from superficial data. Symbols of authority or decency or stupidity can stand in for actual qualities or skills. The outer appearance can mislead us into assumptions about the inner reality. So a man in a white coat must be a doctor. A flashy car must be a signal of great riches and accomplishment. If someone seems slow and ponderous, they must be a dimwit. When we hear clients describing themselves, it's often in terms of generalizations like, I'm so fussy, I'm slow to learn, I'm aggressive, I'm easily addicted, I'm shy, I'm obsessive, I'm prone to guilt, So they smack a label on themselves and come to believe that's who they are. This may be somewhat accurate, or it may be well wide of the mark. If a client's self-assessment seems greatly at odds with all available evidence, then we might, at some time, begin to gently challenge those limiting beliefs. But of course, every client will have genuine personality traits, some of which they may view as unmitigated handicaps. Considering ourselves to be fundamentally shy or guilt-ridden can make us feel hopeless if we view these traits as irrefutably negative and unchangeable. So how might we reframe negative traits? So tip number 1 is to look for the positives in the negative. For every action, there's a reaction. Nothing is so good that too much of it won't be bad, and few things are so bad that in some contexts, and to some extent, they might not provide some benefit. Some recent research found that simply believing that a negative personality trait has a positive silver lining is enough to boost performance in that area. For example, believing that pessimism may be a sign of realism paradoxically made people feel less pessimistic. When people were induced to believe they were impulsive, but then told impulsiveness was linked to creativity, they actually went on to think and act more creatively. Self-perception is important in determining how we feel, think, and perform. When a client defines themselves in limiting terms, I might ask, are there any benefits to being prone to guilt, or introverted, or whatever the case may be? This, at least, may help your client consider the deficit in a more positive way. I asked one client, Sharon, whether there was any value in being fussy, and she thought about it and replied that it meant she had high standards. To another client, Robert, I asked whether there were any upsides to being introverted, as he described himself, and after a time he stated that he read a lot and thought deeply about stuff. So you're a deep thinker, I suggested to him. And he said, yes, in some ways I am. So we've gone from introverted, which he'd framed as a negative trait, to a deep thinker. So here we're simply exploring the trait and helping clients consider it in more nuanced and less pervasively negative ways. But sometimes we may need to go a little further. If a client is really struggling to see their self-proclaimed trait in more flexible ways, we might do the following. So tip 2 is to suggest a potential positive aspect of a negative trait. So I sometimes mention research to clients, and one client, Jane, told me wretchedly, I'm just a guilt-ridden wreck. And I said to her, so you're prone to guilt? And she replied, yes, and it's screwing up my life. So we discussed how proneness to guilt was in some ways spoiling her life and leaving her open to devious manipulation from certain other people and so on. But then I mentioned eventually that it was curious that proneness to guilt conferred benefits, and I left that sort of hanging. But Jane looked curious. You mean it makes people more decent? And I nodded to her suggestion and expanded on it. And I said, also according to research, people prone to feeling guilty tend to be harder workers and better leaders. And yet another piece of research found that being prone to guilt made people more trustworthy. And then I sort of added reflectively to Jane, I guess there are some positives to most things. One guy, Paul, came to me for blushing, which we worked on successfully. Initially, he was terribly embarrassed about the blushing, which others had noticed. And I reflected how curious it was that many blushers assume others must think they're timid or ineffectual, when research actually shows that people deem blushers to be more trustworthy than average. Another client, Susie, told me that she was a chronic worrier, And when she'd said this for the third or fourth time, I asked her, as we had at that point a good level of rapport, if she'd always had such a good imagination. And she laughed at that and said, "You're right, if only I could put my creativity to good use." So this is an example of how we can bit by bit introduce wider perspectives through questions and humour. Which leads me on to the next point, which is tip number 3. Amplify the good aspects of the trait. Now, I'm not suggesting that we reframe away people's concerns. I mentioned the rapport-breaking dangers of glib contradiction earlier. I'm simply suggesting that when we can recognise where and how a deficit might actually be a benefit, we can help our clients live more adaptively and happily. I asked Robert whether he'd like to continue to be a deep thinker, a quality he felt his introversion gave him. And he replied that he would, and in fact would like to become more of a deep thinker, but that he would also like to feel more relaxed and confident around other people. So once we have defined any use or benefit for the trait, even the propensity to panic may potentially be life-saving in the right context, we can then suggest that a goal of therapy might be to keep or amplify the benefits and start to diminish the detrimental or maladaptive parts of the trait. When we glean the positives from a trait, it can help a client feel less shame around it. So here's a few examples. So someone labeled unable to focus at school, we could perhaps explore the idea that maybe they're fundamentally action-orientated. Prone to anger, able to stick up for oneself, stubborn, self-assured and determined. So those are just a few ideas. This isn't to say that we need to or should even try to reframe every situation or psychological problem as a positive. But if a client seems to exhibit a genuine ongoing personality trait, then we can certainly help them find the useful aspects of that, amplify those useful aspects, and diminish the less useful parts. I'm reminded of a particular Milton Erickson case in which a young woman, presumably in the days before cosmetic surgery, believed, because of the gap in her front teeth, that she'd never find love. And somehow Erickson convinced this young woman to use her deficit at a water fountain at work, where a young man she liked would often be at break time. She was to use the gap in her teeth to playfully squirt water at him. Erickson's client actually did this. Don't ask me how he convinced her to do that. And the young man she was attracted to found it funny and even charming, and they got together and eventually married. All because, on one level, the gap in her teeth, the very feature she believed before would always prevent her from that kind of happiness. She was never able to feel negatively about the unsightly gap in her teeth again. As Erickson himself said, until you're willing to be confused about what you already know, what you know will never grow bigger, better, or more. Certainties, especially negative ones, have a way of dampening life down, like rain at a picnic. We think we know our faults, but do we really? Could it be that we can view them afresh and be encouraged by reflecting on who we are? Can our clients become less sure that they're as defective as they've been led by themselves and others to believe? So I hope you found that useful, and if you did, please hit like and subscribe. And if you want to hear when my next video is published, hit the notification bell below. I'm Mark Tyrrell of Uncommon Knowledge, and if you'd like to subscribe to my email newsletter, you can find it over at unk.com/blog. And thanks for watching.